So many people seem to think that their quilt is not good enough to be sent to a longarmer, and I've heard that enough times now that I think it's something we really need to discuss. That's why in this video, I'm going to be sharing my top 5 reasons why I think that is complete nonsense, because of course your quilt is beautiful, and if you want to, you should send it to a longarmer. Are you ready for a pep talk? Let's do it. So where does this idea of not good enough even come from? First of all, if somebody told you that your quilt is not good enough, I want you to give me their name and their phone number because I'm going to have a discussion with them. But more likely, it's actually something that you've been telling yourself, and maybe you're just being overly critical of your own work. Because think about this, if somebody presented you with the exact quilt that you're not sure about and they said, hey, I made this, I'm thinking about sending it to a longarmer, what do you think, is it good enough? What would you say to them? You'd probably tell them that they should definitely do that and encourage them to get it done if they wanted to, right? So I want you to try and show yourself the same amount of grace that you would show somebody else. But maybe you're thinking, no, Shelly, you just don't get it. This quilt is really wonky. And I hear you, and I accept that there is a possibility that your quilt is wonky. But I want you to know that just because it's wonky doesn't mean it's not worthy of longarming. If you want to send your quilt to a longarmer and you have the means to do so, I 100% think you should. If your goal is perfection, oh boy, have I got some news for you. Never once in the history of all my years of longarming has a client come to me and said, Shelly, this is the one. This quilt I'm handing to you is absolutely perfect. Do you know why? Because there's no such thing as a perfect quilt. Every quilt, whether it was made by a beginner or someone with a lot of experience, has got some kind of flaws in it. Whether that is points being chopped off or fullness in blocks or seams being misaligned, I promise you that there's going to be something a little bit off about every quilt that you ever make. And that's totally normal and it's totally fine. For example, here's just a stack of quilts that I went and grabbed from my living room, and every single one of them has got some sort of error in it. But that did not stop me from longarming them. Now they're finished, they're ready to be used, and they're all better off for it. Which brings me to my next point. You know what would have been really sad for these quilts? As if I had let their imperfections stop me from continuing on the journey and quilting them and turning them into these finished projects. Because it would have been really disappointing for me to spend all that time and money and energy sewing up those quilt tops only to chuck them in a closet for who knows how long. So trust me when I say that an imperfect finished quilt is so much better than a quilt top in your closet, because you can't really sit on the couch and cuddle up underneath an unfinished quilt top. Or when you make up the bed and you're preparing for your guests to arrive, you don't really want to drape it with an unfinished quilt top with all of the threads hanging off of it. It's much better to have a finished project. So I would really encourage you to embrace whatever imperfections may exist in your quilt and send it or bring it to a longarm quilter, because I promise they're going to be super excited to work on it for you. I have never turned away a quilt because it wasn't good enough for my standards. That is just something that has never happened and never will happen. And I'll tell you that I quilt for a lot of first-time quilters. A lot of people, the first quilt they ever made, they send to me for longarming. Maybe because I'm so non-judgmental. So I get a lot of quilts in the mail, and I promise you that when I open them up, my first thought is never like, Judy, you should have tried harder. It's just not something that I'm thinking. Instead, I'm usually excited about the colors or the piecing or the overall look. And I'm thinking about how is it that I can elevate this project through adding quilting stitches. And yes, I am definitely looking at it through the lens of paying attention if there's any areas that are going to need some special attention. For instance, a client recently sent me a quilt in the mail and she apologized the entire time. She was like, Shelly, I'm so sorry about this quilt. I am an experienced quilter, but for some reason I just had trouble with this one. And if you get it and you look at it and you think this is terrible, there's no way I could ever quilt this, just send it back to me and don't worry about it. And I was like, girl, that is not going to happen. So when I looked at her quilt, yes, there were some areas that had fullness in them, but all I did was use my knowledge and my skills and my experience as a longarmer to pick a pantograph that was going to sort of disguise and minimize the look of those areas of fullness rather than accentuate them. The quilt came in the mail, I made some executive decisions, I quilted it, I sent it back to her, she's happy, I'm happy, everybody wins. So if you are not sending your quilt to a longarmer because you're worried that they're going to judge you, I want you to just let that go, because it's just not something that happens. If you've never tried it before, you're going to love longarm quilting. You send away a quilt top and maybe some backing, and you get back this beautiful, nearly finished project that's got amazing stitches in it that you could never have put in using your domestic sewing machine. And best of all, there's no sweat, there's no tears, there's no crawling around on the floor in order to baste your quilt sandwich. But don't just take it from me. I have had so many clients over the years tell me that they cannot believe how much quilting has changed and elevated their project and brought it to the next level. But of course, you have to find the right long arm quilter to match with. And I think of this kind of like the relationship that you might have with a hairstylist. You've got to find somebody that you trust and that can communicate with you really well, because you want to make sure that you end up with the results that you're looking for. So if you're looking for a long armor to add some magic to your next project, I'm going to put a link in the description below to a list of different long arm quilters. I'm located in Canada, and while I do accept international parcels, it is just kind of a hassle for people to send things to Canada. It takes a really long time for parcels to arrive. It costs extra because there's usually duty, and then just the shipping fees, you would not believe how much it costs to send to Canada. So when it comes to finding your perfect match with a longarmer, I would recommend that you start locally first. I hope this video has given you the encouragement that you needed to get your quilts long-armed. As I said, it's a completely magical service that has been really game-changing for a lot of quilters, especially because it helps them get a lot more projects finished rather than just collecting quilt tops for years and years. If you're looking for inspiration for your next project, you might want to check out my video all about my 2 at a time 9-patch block method. It's a really classic but super fast and easy project that comes together in a snap and will have you diving in your scrap bins to find all kinds of pretty little pieces to use. As always, I'm wishing you happy quilting, and I'll see you in my next video.